Hello and good afternoon, everyone. I'm Kiara Katapan. I'm the Assistant Managing Editor of Living City Magazine. Together with New City Press of the Focolare Movement, we are hosting this webinar series called Dare to Care. It was first created to address some of the questions around the coronavirus pandemic, and we wanted to also promote what Focolare President Maria Voce has coined the antivirus of unity. Now, on top of our current health crisis, we're now faced with another form of a deadly threat as we grapple with a cry for social justice in wake of the deaths of George Floyd, and as the title says, and more. One as recent as the Friday night fatal shooting of Rayshard Brooks. Now, we'd like to open this conversation today with the goal of trying to understand what is at stake, how did we get here, and where we can go from here. So before we begin, I'd like to present to you our three distinguished panelists. First, we have Judge David Shaheed, who was voted by the Indiana Correctional Association as Judge of the Year in 2007. And you'll hear from him more later of how that is so well deserved. And Judge Shaheed wears two other hats. He is an associate professor for the School of Public and Environmental Affairs at Indiana University in Indianapolis. And he's also the chair of the Center for Interfaith Cooperation, having been part of the delegation of Imam W.D. Muhammad in the first ever Muslim Focolare Christian Dialogue in 1999. Next, we have Alba Doto, who's been in private practice for 30 years, an associate professor of law as well at Massachusetts School of Law for 25 years. And we'll hear more from Alba about her client-focused approach. Lastly, we have Nate Tinner-Williams, who joins us to speak as a millennial Catholic with a passion for theology and history. Welcome to all three. Welcome to all our participants. And now we'll begin with a general question to get us started. What was your initial reaction to that first event of the death of George Floyd and the ensuing protest since then? Judge Shaheed, would like to begin with you.
Okay, thank you. For me, it was very personal. When I was starting out as a lawyer in 1987, I represented the estate or the mother of a 16-year-old African-American youth who was found shot in the head, handcuffed behind his back in the backseat of a police car. And then the police said that he had committed suicide. And so it was, it took 9 years to get the case to trial. But during that 9 years, I lived, what probably the lawyers and the family members of George Floyd are dealing with. So it's very personal for me because, it caused me to kind of relive that situation. The part that to me has been most encouraging is that the protests have led to a discussion of systematic racism. And although you can focus on police, the issue from a broader perspective is systematic racism. Just as a slight point that I think everyone would understand is unemployment insurance. Right now with COVID-19 all across the country, all across the world, various governments have been paying unemployment insurance wages to people that are not employed because they've been laid off. Early on, when that was started in the 30s, because racism was so systemic in America, they did not want Blacks to have access to unemployment insurance. So they carved out a provision that agricultural workers and domestic workers could not receive unemployment insurance, primarily because African Americans were the ones that were primarily doing agricultural work and domestic work. So that's just an example of the system that that discriminates against African Americans, you know, at all levels, healthcare, unemployment, police, so forth.
Thank you, Judge Shaheed. Alba? Alba, what is your take on that?
So thank you. So I sat for a long time trying to discern whether or not I had a voice really to be heard in this discussion, on this panel, on this issue, because I have done nothing but benefit from racism. So other than the systematic benefit that I get because my non-white sisters have not been able to achieve through an institutional systematic situation, I don't have any experience. And so I was pretty mindful about what my opinion was. We all have an opinion, but to really have a voice is something different. And so I've sort of been listening, and two things that struck me, which let me say yes to this panel, that I think also sort of gives an overview of how I see this entire situation, or my reaction to this entire situation. One was from a minister who quoted Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and said, "In the end, we will remember not the words of our enemies, but the silence of our friends." And when I heard that quote, I realized I had a voice, because silence is, I don't want to be the silent friend. Silence has not been a strong suit of mine, probably ever. And so I saw that I had a voice. And then I also focused on what happened to this man, like his words, George Floyd's words. To see him, to say his name, to focus on the words that he said. And at a certain point, he cried out for his mother. And I thought, I have found my voice, as not just as one of the non-silent friends, but also as a mother who's raising two children, and non-white children, children of color, one of who's male, who I have continuously focused on issues regarding racism that he will face that I never had to face. And so rather than continue to simply benefit from the systematic racism, I've tried with my practice in my life to sort of recognize that and see how that then interplays into my relationship with my clients, my life, my people, the process through which my clients will then enter through this system. And so I think that I feel that my voice is one of the non-silent friends.
Beautiful. Thank you. Thank you, Alba. And Nate? What do you think about?
Yeah, for me, I guess it's a little different from first two respondents, partially because I'm a millennial and I'm online and have been online my whole life. Just that I grew up in the social media generation. So for me, George Floyd was obviously not the first instance of a Black person, even a Black man, being killed for no good reason on camera by the police. And so it would be a misstatement to say George Floyd was different for me, but my reaction to it has been different. I'm in a different set of mind now than I have been in the past. Partially, I would say, because I'm Catholic, I feel like I'm in a space now where I can speak freely and with a target. And so when the George Floyd murder came to light, along with multiple others in that same time period, I felt like I now had a space where I could speak and be heard by people that needed to hear it, and also to get support in what I was saying. And on a secondary level, it's also been a time for me to learn, because I did not grow up in a generation where racism was as overt as someone who was born in the 50s or 60s or even 70s. So we talk a lot about systemic racism now. And in my mind, that could almost be translated to subtle racism, which is what I would say is the kind of racism that I grew up around, or just, the kind of racism that's hard for anyone to detect unless they do some reading or they're told by someone who's an expert. And growing up in the generation of subtle racism, there was a lot of things I needed to learn about not so subtle racism that led to this point, and kind of crystallized a lot of the systems that are in place now that are harmful. So George Floyd has been a great time of learning for me about the police, about the history of the United States in relation to the police, in relation to white supremacy, even as we're seeing monuments torn down, and as a kind of zenith of the protests that erupted after George Floyd and Breonna Taylor were murdered. And so now, yeah, it's as if everyone in the country and even around the world are coming to a sort of reckoning with where we are today and how that relates to our not so bright past, even in the last 75 years.
Right. So true. Thank you. Thank you. Wow, we have three very different perspectives, shaped by our personal experience. So that really makes sense. So if we could get back to Judge Shaheed, if you could unpack for us a little bit from your criminal justice perspective and experience, what has it been like to work in a system where you've seen the incarceration disproportionately of people of color? Could you talk to us a little bit about that?
It's such an important conversation, and I'm going to share with Greg, some resources that people can use to become more informed about these issues. And one is The New Jim Crow, which is by Michelle Alexander, which analyzes, she really dissects mass incarceration so that you understand the roots of it. It starts with slavery, the end of slavery, 13th Amendment, and so forth. But as a judge, one of the things that impacted my life, and with judges, especially judges in a large metropolitan area, you can kind of specialize. And for most of at the beginning of my legal judicial career, I was in civil court. I lost an election, which was really the best thing that could have happened, because I ended up in criminal court, where I could see firsthand what was happening disproportionately with African Americans. One of the other terms that you could Google and search is the school to prison pipeline. And there is a definite pipeline that starts with, in elementary school, believe it or not, with the suspension, expulsion, and putting into alternative school African Americans disproportionately. That number of those who are disproportionately taken out of elementary school, that also follows into the juvenile system, where African Americans are disproportionately penalized in the juvenile justice system. And then you get that same number in the adult system of incarceration. So it starts, believe it or not, in the schools, and it ends up, having African Americans, especially men, in prison. One of the things that I consider kind of a gift of my association with the Focolare is I was invited to several conferences or meetings at Castel Gandolfo. And one of those gave me the idea for starting a reentry court in Indianapolis, in Indiana, where I was working at the time. And Kiara Lubick and the people that I met during that conference helped me, I would say, have the courage to start a reentry court to help incarcerated people coming back to the community have a better chance of succeeding. Parole and probation were not working. but reentry is a new model for helping ex-offenders make the transition back into the community.
Wow, excellent. If anyone would like to ask any further questions, please don't hesitate to type it in the Q&A box in the bottom. This would make for so many interesting further conversations and in-depth analysis. Now, we'd like to turn back to Alba. You, in your experience as an attorney, what types of challenges do your clients face that seem to recur, which could suggest that there's a more structural issue at play there than an individual choice of action?
I think the criminalization of poverty is really the most systemic challenge for my clients and for the criminal justice system as a whole, at least from the perspective of a criminal defense attorney in the city area where I work. Lots of the new reforms, so-called, in the statutes, the criminal statutes, can remove long sentences, but they don't remove the fines that go along with those sentences. And so my clients who are unable to then pay those fines don't reap the benefit of the revitalization of the statute, so that their criminal activity then, or their non-criminal activity becomes criminal when the fine isn't paid, or a petty fine or a small fine becomes a much larger situation. And also those criminal penalties that involve fines affect other parts of an individual's life, which the criminal statute doesn't necessarily recognize. So it affects housing, it affects the association with your children. If you have involvement with the Department of Children and Families, then that kind of situation, although it might not affect you criminally, an admission which would cause you to have a fine, and then the non-payment of that fine, which then turns criminal, affects your ability to care for your children and to maintain an intact family unit. So small issues like driving, people don't realize, at least here from my perspective, that decriminalizing the first offense for driving under the influence is a good, perhaps, result for all parties. But if you don't remove the large fines along with that criminal penalty, then an entire segment of the population then continues to suffer disproportionately, because you've now criminalized the fact that they're unable to pay for that fine. And then you further criminalize the situation. Now they can't get to work because their sole means of transportation is removed. And there isn't an adequate public transportation system to allow for this particular individual to do that. So I would say systemically, the challenge most prevalent is this criminalization of poverty. There are also thousands of criminal defendants who are awaiting trial, who are innocent, they are presumed innocent, who are unable to meet bail. And bail is not, the sole purpose is to ensure that an individual is not a danger to himself or the public and returns to court. But if someone isn't able to make $100 bail, then you're not supplying the reason that goes along with that. You're simply criminalizing the fact that this person isn't able to make that $100 bail, and that person is being incarcerated without ever having faced an accuser, had a trial. They're being incarcerated because of their poverty. You're criminalizing the fact that they're unable to make $100 bail. So there's no need for that to occur. There's no need for that criminalization to occur. We've systematically done that. We have to systematically undo that. So when we talk about reforming criminal justice statutes, we also need to recognize that we need to reform them in manners that assist all segments of the population, not just a segment. We have to realize that criminalizing poverty takes place every time we continue to reform without removing certain barriers that are financial in nature.
Right, thank you. Wow. Interesting that you mentioned about driving under the influence. We just got a letter today, just a little parenthesis, from an inmate in Texas who was asking for a subscription to Living City, but he was in there since January for a DUI charge and is still waiting for, you know, his trial because of the COVID. So these are very real issues that we're facing. How about you, Nate? Again, as a millennial, you were saying that you're quite a bit online. There must be a lot of talk right now about what's, you know, white privilege. And you even mentioned that in your intro about that subtle racism. Could you explain that a little bit to us here?
About white privilege or about subtle racism?
Both. How does that play out?
Well, I think Alba just spoke about one of many aspects, the way that something can appear to be race neutral, but in reality is not at all. And we live in a unique context in that regard, in that because of the way American history has played out in relation to white supremacy, it's not very hard in 2020 to implement a system that doesn't mention Black people, but disproportionately affects them. And unfortunately, I think over time, over the years, leaders have known that and taken advantage of that fact for whatever reason, whether in implementing them or refusing to de-implement them. And, you know, today we just, often a Black person could live their life and never have someone call them a bad word or tell them we're not going to do X positive thing for you because you're Black. And yet it's baked into the system. And I use the word subtle because it's not obvious to most anyone. Again, like I said, that's not an expert or just who hasn't done the reading or who's just otherwise not informed or educated on these matters. And that's the real tragedy, I think, is that so many people don't know what's going on, white, Black, whatever. They just assume that because they don't live in that explicitly racist world that existed in America from its founding up until perhaps the end of the civil rights movement, they assume that because they live in this more sanitized world that, you know, we're not racist at all. We're so far removed from it that it's not affecting anyone, when the reality is that it's just taken on a different form. And that's something people are beginning to realize, and the people that have known it for a long time are finally being listened to, I think.
Mm-hmm. Right, thank you, thank you. Well, and how about we go back to Judge Shaheed? No, wait, let's go back to Alba. I'm sorry. You know, there's a lot of talk these days as well about the police brutality. And one of the proposals is to defund police departments to try to shift some of that funding towards other educational opportunities, housing, healthcare. Do you think that's an answer to racism, or what other things do you feel an average citizen can do to create the conditions to ensure racial equality? I know that's a lot of mouthful.
Yeah, well, I mean, so I think the answer to racism is multifaceted. I don't think that one aspect of defunding the police is going to solve racism, because I think that we have spent many years systematically including racism in our statutes and our societal norms, that it's going to take a little bit more than defunding the police to eradicate something that is inbred, that has been systematically under privileging an entire segment of the population. So I don't think that that can be just one thing that's going to solve that. I think attacking racism has to be multifaceted, has to come from a lot of different places. Defunding the police, I don't think it's a horrific idea. I think there's been lots of movement in that direction. There's been groups that have been seeking to demilitarize our police, which we've been doing. We've been continuing to escalate militarizing our police since probably, after World War II, when we decided to use selective, put military service at the top of the civil service exam. But there have been calls to, and the way we dress police officers now is continue to militarize police. So there's been movement seeking to demilitarize police for a long time. And I don't think that defunding the police department is at all a bad idea. And I think, in fact, it's a step in the right direction. My concern, at least from what I've seen in my city, where we have a mayor indicating he's seeking to defund portions of the police and redirect those funds by calling racism a public health crisis, is my fear is those funds are not going to go to the community. And so my caveat to defunding the police would be not to give the funds to another institution, which is, it needs to go to the community. It needs to go to the boots on the ground, the people in the neighborhood. They know how and why and where the services are needed, what kind of services are most helpful, what will work. They've been doing it on a shoestring budget for years. By infusing them with the income they need, I think they can have the most impact. So while I'm hopeful that that is a step in the right direction, I'm cautiously optimistic that those funds will go to the right places. And I don't, unfortunately, think it will be a solution. I think the last portion of your question is, what do you think our focus should be? Focusing on our common humanity has to be the first step. For me, recognizing that I've continued to benefit from a system has been very important to my development, I think, as a person, but also as an attorney. I think if we can't focus on our common humanity, regardless of anything, we can't move forward as a community, as a people. It will be impossible for us if I don't recognize you as a human being. If I dehumanize you, it's much easier for me to talk about you objectively and then take advantage of you, subjugate you, make implicit and explicit laws that continue to systematically underprivilege you in your neighborhood and your environment. So while I think I'm hopeful that we are moving it in lots of good directions, I'm optimistic that we're able to have conversations as white people, as parents, that we've never had before. I think as a church, my church needs to have more conversation about this rather than less conversation. I think basically our commonality will save us, our humanity.
Thank you. And I'll segue into that question about the church being that it's also an institution. So Nate, you who are a lifelong Christian but new to the Catholic Church, could you just tell us a little bit about your experience in this faith journey, and what do you think are some of the gifts that the Black Catholics can bring to the Catholic Church that perhaps we are not completely, in tune with or aware of? Thanks.
I think given that Black Catholics are at the intersection of the largest religion in the world and also the most oppressed people group in America, is that they're an untapped resource, as you intimated. They are unique in that they have survived, that they exist, and that they continue to believe and continue to have hope for the future. And I think that during their existence here in the United States, and of course you could interpret Black Catholics as referring to people of the African diaspora all over the New World, as well as in the Western world, that they have over the years been a unique voice in the way that they've spoken up. Recently, I tapped into a resource that I had heard about, but only within the past month or so actually got a hold of and read, which was a statement from the Black Catholic clergy from 1968. Actually, it wasn't just clergy, it was clergy and religious and some sisters as well, at least one sister. And they spoke up in a very unique way about the racial situation in America, and about racism, and about systemic racism, and about the Black community's reaction to it, and how it should be understood from, how it could be understood from a Black perspective, and how it should be understood more widely from anyone's perspective. And it's a powerful document, and the way that they come at the issue kind of cuts through the noise of this kind of politispeak that would come out in reaction to protests and riots then, and that we're seeing pretty much the same way coming out now. And it's the kind of thing you would only get from Black Catholicism because of that intersection that I spoke about, where they are speaking from a place of power and influence, as well as from a place of oppression and suppression. And so that kind of mixing creates this voice that I think a lot of people are missing out on, and in a lot of ways is not, is itself not being put out as forcefully as I would like it to be personally. I realized recently that the Black Catholic clergy, that same group that put out the statement in 1968, doesn't really have active social media. And as a millennial, it just drops my jaw to the floor. And I'm hoping that Black Catholicism will expand its voice in this situation and in the era to come.
Thanks. Very good you. And I'd like to close this portion of this webinar with Judge Shaheed. I know you have been very involved in interfaith dialogue, and so how do you see faith communities working to promote social equality, racial?
Well, I want to go back to something Alba said earlier, which I think was so powerful it needs to be said again. And that is the importance of everyone finding their voice in this moment. One of the kind of cardboard signs that I saw at a protest in Indianapolis was "Silence is violence." And if people take the view that this is not my issue, or I'll let somebody else kind of be in the forefront, then the system as it currently is set up in terms of, say, for example, defunding the police, will remain as it currently is situated. I just wanted to perhaps give this suggestion for those who may be protesting now or may not see their place, in a protest, but maybe are looking for some other place to kind of find their voice. In particular with the conversation about defund the police, that can mean a number of things. It also can mean redirecting resources. And we have a democracy that unfortunately many people ignore and kind of look at and kind of rely upon other people to kind of go to those meetings, listen to what the city councilors are saying, or the legislators are saying, and then maybe they read about it or not. But if we could just have 1/10 of those who are protesting go to city council meetings, go to the committee, the public safety committee meetings that are associated before a city council takes action on resources, such as shifting resources from the police department to someplace else. Those are conversations that have to take place in a democracy. And so if 1/10 of those people who are protesting just go to committee meetings, city council meetings, become informed about what the issues are, that is the process by which their voices are heard and the people who are making the decisions change their positions. One suggestion I can make, just from my years on the bench and being involved in criminal justice, is that one resource that can be changed or shifted that makes sense, and there's much literature. I mean, there are tons of legal articles have been written on this, is the waste associated with incarcerating people for mental health issues. Right now, about 1/3 of the people incarcerated in jails across the country, maybe across the world, but across the country, are people with mental health issues. And the sheriffs in those communities are the ones that are responsible for, housing inmates in the jails. But the courts have a concern about it, the police have a concern about it, but they always kind of shift the focus. Well, it's not my problem exclusively. But if there could be a shift in resources from policing to addressing the needs of individuals with mental health issues, it would save money. And it's the more humane thing to do, as Alba was saying. And it would change the structure of criminal justice, because a large number of those who are in jail because of mental health issues are people of color. So if you wanted to have one humane issue, not an issue where people that are opposed to Black Lives Matter, it's not that issue, it's about mental health issues. And you can shift those monies to help those people with mental health issues so that they get out of jail, and that saves money for everyone in the community, and it's a more humane way to run the system. But we all need to find a way in this moment, as Alba said, to find our voice and have that voice lead to some kind of action that's going to make a difference. Otherwise, the system that has been in place for over 400 years will continue to evolve as it has continued to evolve, celebrating white privilege and keeping other people of color on the bottom.
Thank you. Very important, very concrete. I will definitely. Now I'd like to pass that over to Greg Metzer, who's the sales director of New City Press, and he's been gathering the questions that are arriving from the audience. Greg?
Yes, thank you. And we really do have quite a few questions that have come in, and I'm going to be bringing those and trying to bring some of them into a couple questions into one. And we'll just build off of where the judge just was into a number of questions around practical steps that people can be involved in. The judge has mentioned mental health issues, as well as local politics and local governmental boards. And I'm wondering if either of the other panelists have, in addition to that, on a practical level of steps that people can be taking to begin to work on some of these issues.
So I don't think I could stress enough what my cautious optimism about the reallocation of resources should look like or sound like or be like. And I think that Judge Shaheed has made reference to the reallocation of those funds is not to just one person. Because we live in a democracy, we can influence what happens with those funds. And so we will lose a great opportunity if we succeed as a people in, I would say, demilitarizing our police force first, or defunding our police and not allocating those resources to the places where they can go to assist the communities that have been impacted most adversely and disproportionately than other communities. And if we don't seize the opportunity, we're simply going to give the funds from one institution that use them poorly to another institution that's going to utilize them poorly. So if we don't seek our democratic process to the fullest extent that we can by influencing what occurs with those funds, we'll miss a great opportunity.
Thank you. And Nate, perhaps you can build on this question first. There's a number of people that are asking questions related to what the church can be doing, reference to the USCCB statement from a couple years ago, the pastoral letter on racism. Wondering if you have found that helpful and if there's other resources that speak directly to what the Catholic community in particular can be doing.
Yeah, I think, if I'm honest, millennials may be a bit tired of statements. They don't see the same value in them, I think, that perhaps previous generations did. While it's important for these organizations to speak out, it's even more important for them to take action. That's one of the reasons I so valued the statement that came from the Black Catholic clergy in 1968, because it laid out an action plan, like things that they wanted the bishops and the church to do to help Black Catholics and Black people in general. And for the most part, you can probably guess whether or not it was implemented in any substantial way. And so when I have looked at responses to the current situation, the murder of George Floyd and others, I wish and hope that there will be more action, specific action that is meant to lift up the Black community and those who are oppressed specifically. And I know in America we have this, many people have an aversion to treating certain groups specially, but the reality is that for 500 years you did treat a certain group especially bad. And so those same groups need to be treated especially well now. And until the church does that, we're going to be in a hole. So I think that right now what Catholics can do is to talk to their leaders and to advocate for policies and procedures and programs that will uniquely benefit those who have been uniquely oppressed for some centuries now.
Yeah, if I could just add something to what Nate just said in terms of within the Catholic community, and this kind of comes from my interfaith work. There's a very important book, and I'll give this to Greg, and it's called White Fragility by Robyn D'Angelo. Also, she's on YouTube. So if you just type in on YouTube, White Fragility or Robyn D'Angelo, you can get a brief summary of what she's talking about. And the reason why I mention that is that in addition to the church leadership, I think it's also important for us to have a conversation, in particular, white people, to have a conversation with other white people about this moment. Because I know from my experience growing up in Southern Indiana, when people in those small rural communities see those protests, in these large cities, that translates into fear for them because many of them have not ever been around a Black person, an African American. And so they get their images of what Black people are like off television. And so I think it's very important in this moment for white people to have a conversation with other white people about what this moment means. And since social media and Zoom has become the new medium of choice, if one Catholic would introduce via Zoom one of their family members who had never been in conversation with an African American, introduce them over Zoom just to an African American, that may do a lot to humanize people that have been dehumanized for centuries. The whole history of slavery is based upon the dehumanization of people of color. And so if white people would introduce one of their neighbors or relatives to an African-American person just so they would be able to see the humanity of this person, that can go a long way to changing the environment in which we live, just one person at a time.
Thank you, Judge.
I also would like to,
sure, go ahead, Alba.
sorry, Greg. I'd like to comment on something that Nate said as well. So I agree. I sometimes am tired of statements and statements and statements and statements and no change of any systematic reality that are faced by people every single day. And yet when I was talking with my friends and family and groups in my church community, one of the things that became important was that if you don't talk, then you can't do. So if we can't talk about systematic racism, if we can't recognize that we've benefited from a group that has been systematically underserviced, then we can't do anything about it. We have to first recognize this place of privilege, and that place of privilege came at the expense of my non-white sister's place of underprivilege. So if we can't have these discussions, then we can't do anything. We can't come together with a social justice program if we're unwilling to talk about them. And so I agree that there needs to be more action rather than these statements, but I think that the conversation that has been ongoing in communities that are just finding that they can have a voice is a great way to proceed towards an action plan that may be able to address some, at least in small part, of the systematic changes that need to happen. And so I wholeheartedly agree with you, and I think we have to do.
Thank you. So a question about young people, and also another question that's kind of connected to that involving the intersection of race, poverty, and family structure issues. There's a question: what is the responsibility of every community to help heal young people who have or are suffering from racism? And perhaps we can answer that with some allusion to the role of families in helping in these situations. Alba, I was thinking in particular some things you had said at the beginning about your family situation that might be helpful if you can reflect on that.
Yeah, so of course. So yeah, I think, these conversations within families are important to occur as well. I'm a white mom of children of color, and so I recognize that I speak to my children perhaps differently than my other family members or colleagues would speak to their children about, especially my son, about what sort of interactions can occur. And so to be cognizant of that, I think is interesting for me, that I am so sort of subconsciously cognizant of that. But also I think part of the healing process is, again, to within families, to talk about these issues, and to talk about these problems, and to talk about these situations, and to talk about what is going on in the community around us, because I don't think that people see themselves as racist people. In church communities, they're not necessarily talking about solutions to the criminalization of poverty because it doesn't have an effect on them, because they're not watching that particular situation occurring. They're not within that community. They don't see themselves as racist. They don't see that as a race problem. They don't see that happening to one community disproportionately to another. So the conversation doesn't occur and healing can't occur. So I think, one of the ways to heal is to recognize to say the words that recognize that the situation exists, and to try to move beyond the situation itself to a real recognition of humanity.
Thank you.
I think the role of the family, as always, has been to be a microcosm of what the rest of the community should be. And by healing from within the family, we can heal within the community.
Yeah, one thing I can say, Greg, about family, and it's been a little different for me because, I have a son, plus I have grandsons. And when my grandsons were teenagers, I had what is called the conversation about what happens if you're stopped by the police. And I took them to see Fruitvale Station about an African-American on New Year's several years ago in the Bay Area who was killed. And so they saw that, and then we had a conversation about how basically life is not fair, but when you have an encounter with law enforcement, it's not about your rights, it's about surviving that situation. So they're kind of different conversations that take place, I think, in the African-American community about how to live and survive in America.
I think, go ahead, Greg.
No, go, right on.
This morning I was listening to a speech from Mario Savio, who I believe founded the free speech movement. And it's his most famous speech. And he talks about how systems of power and oppression can get to the point where they're so repugnant, but also so powerful and immovable, seemingly immovable, that those who truly care have to put their bodies on the gears of the system to ensure that, if for no other reason, their own sacrifice will ensure that that system can no longer function the way that it has been. And I think that's important when you talk about stopping these cycles that we see, cycles of destruction in certain communities, because when you see almost a third of the Black community living in poverty, suffering from poverty, making decisions that cause it to be cyclical, or that help cause it to be cyclical, you're seeing systemic racism at work. And a lot of people are trying right now to understand systemic racism, but it's important to include that in your thinking, is that when you see systemic racism working the way that it intends to, which is destruction of the family, you're seeing that is what you're looking at. You're looking at systemic racism in those moments. And we have to put our bodies on the gears of that system, which often plays out, I think, in, speaking to those people who are making those decisions, or like Judge Shaheed said, showing up to city council meetings and whatever avenues we can to say, we're not going to allow this to continue the way it is right now, by speaking truth to power and also speaking truth to those who are being harmed by that power. That is, I think that's the way that we can put our bodies on the gears today, and hopefully stop the machine from running the way that it is, and then eventually taking that system apart piece by piece and throwing it in the trash.
I wonder, this next question really ties into what you were saying, Nate, in terms of those conversations and even protests. Is one person asked a question where she's saying that she's engaged in conversations and she confesses to just at times just a feeling of infuriation and sometimes where the violence that we're sometimes seeing in the protest becomes the grid. And so I wonder if you could speak to that feeling of frustration in conversations, and then also around that idea of some of the looting and violence that people are seeing, and it's kind of amplified on different media outlets and things. If you could maybe help listeners think those things through and how they can maintain conversations about some of the things we've been talking about today.
Yeah, it is really unfortunate that rioting and looting and violence is becoming the locus of conversation right now. But then again, if you think about the way that Black people have been viewed in society, and granted, I know that most of this activity, or at least not all of it, is being perpetrated by Black people. But I mean, even if you see a protest full of white people looting, insofar as it's a reaction to the murder of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, and others, people are seeing it as somehow fueled by the Black community and their reaction. But what I'm saying is a lot of people wanted to see Black people that way and the community that way long before any of these protests occurred. And so when they see it, they're just seeing what they expected to see. They're saying these people are this way and, you know, they're the problem. Their inability to control themselves is the problem. But I think it's important to note that the violence being perpetrated against our community, and when I say our, I mean the Black community, is so ongoing. It's so all-encompassing that eventually it was going to get to this point that, you know, there's going to be some rioting, there's going to be some looting, and there always has been. Starting from slave rebellions all the way up to, you know, people right now just saying enough. And if we got to break some stuff to do it, that's what we're going to do. And while I'm not endorsing that, we certainly can't see it as a surprise. So insofar as people want to speak about rioting and looting and violence, they need to understand it in context. However, that is not the message trying to be sent by these people. That they're not trying to say rioting, looting, and violence is okay. They are expressing anger about the fact that it's been okay for so long to be perpetrated against this group that has been systematically made powerless for 500 years. So, I mean, when you see things in context like that, it gets a little messy as far as trying to point the finger at someone and say what's right and what's wrong. And it certainly has nothing to do with the way forward. I mean, stopping the rioting and looting and violence of these protests is not going to solve systemic racism, I can tell you that. So I think a much deeper conversation has to be had. And in my mind, there are certain steps that people in power could take right now, today, in the next 5 minutes that would end the protests within hours. And the issue is that those people are in no way willing to do that.
Greg, if I could just say this, you know, by all means, as a legal person, as somebody that's served as a judge, you know, there's no support for violence, looting, and protest. The only point I would make is that historically, you know, the one who is in power gets to write the history. And so right now, there's a narrative about what's taking place in the streets associated with Black Lives Matter. But a little over 200 years ago in Tulsa, Oklahoma, Black Wall Street was destroyed. Violence, looting, rioting, a whole Black community was destroyed, but it was never put in the history books. It was never discussed. And that violence is, for the most part, ignored, where there's all the emphasis on the violence of African Americans in the streets at this moment, protesting, you know, systematic discrimination for Black people over the years. So I think on balance, we have to recognize that Black people have been the victims of violence for 400 years. But historically, even with Confederate monuments, that history is celebrated. The enslavement of Black people is celebrated, but that violence is celebrated with monuments, where what's taking place in the streets as protests is looked upon as destructive to America. So I think there needs to be some real cognitive balance about what is violence and who's writing the narrative, or what violence is okay and what violence is not.
I'd just like to also add, I think Nate said something really important too. It's messy. This portion of the conversation is messy. We don't get to put everything in a nice little box. I think we have to be careful that we don't deflect the conversation to what's comfortable with, by saying, look at what's happening, look at the looting, look at the rioting, oh, that's terrible, oh, look at what's happening, what those people, if we want to say those people when we talk about the situation that's happening, we're deflecting the conversation from what's really happening. That's clearly not the message of what's going on. We have to look at the reason why these protests are going on at all. Why are these people here? Why is this happening at all? Without deflecting the conversation to the looting and the violence that's happening afterwards. That is but like less than 1% of the number of people who are participating in these protests, who are voicing years of violence. So it's messy conversation. It doesn't fit in a nice little box, and it's not always going to be like that. It's not always going to fit in a nice little box. But to talk about that and not to talk about why this is going on at all deflects the conversation to a place where it doesn't need to be.
And to clarify something that I said earlier, I said that there are things that people in power could do right now to stop the riots. And what I meant is that there are reforms and institutions of justice that could be enacted right now that would stop the protests almost immediately. But the only methods being employed right now, it seems, for the most part, are violent responses by the police.
So Alba, to your point about really, engaging in these messy conversations, we really want to thank each of you for helping us to start to engage. We thank you for taking all of these different types of questions and responding to them really thoughtfully and pastorally, but also with a sense of history. So we really appreciate that. We also want to restate again, as Judge Shaheed said, there will be an email that will go out that will contain a number of resources to help us continue this conversation. We're really kind of opening up things that we all recognize and need to learn more about. So each of the panelists will provide us some things that will go out in that email to continue the conversation. And so but for now, we just want to say thank you for engaging us in that conversation. And I'm going to pass it back to Kiara for any concluding thoughts.
Thank you, Greg. Thank you to each of our panelists. As Greg has said, you have really opened up our minds to what are some ways that we can start having these conversations that lead to a change. For sure, it has made a profound impact in me. And I'd like to close with an African proverb that came back to me in these days from the Bantu that says, I am because we are. And so I feel like this hour that we've spent is a redefinition of myself, more enriched by the exchange that we just had. So we thank everyone who made this webinar possible. Also, the Fordham Law School, who is a co-sponsor of this webinar. We look forward to seeing you around. Thank you.
Thank you.